Welcome to our demo session. Today we'll show you two code agent solutions we're building. First, AutoB, an agent that generates fully functional backend applications. Next, AutoView, an agent that turns backends and Figma designs into front-end apps. In this session, we'll use these two solutions to build a Reddit-style community app, connect the backend and front-end, and run it live. So then, why don't we begin with AutoB? All right, let's take a look at our AutoB screen. Right now, we've opened AutoB Playground locally in the browser. AutoB is an open source project, and you can find and use it on GitHub. Now let's try entering something into AutoB. Make a Reddit-like community, a simplified version with community, posts, comments, and voting features. As I'm not familiar with programming, please write a requirements analysis report as you see fit. When a user submits a request, the first step, the analyzer agent, begins analyzing the requirements. Through a conversation with the user, it refines the requirements and defines them as documentation for coding. Once that's done, you can either download the results as files or open them in StackBlitz. But since the results also appear in the AutoB project directory, we'll check them there. The document has been neatly organized. Looking into the business rules, we can see that, just as we requested earlier, the business logic needed for the community features has been clearly laid out. Sub-community, membership, posts, comments, voting, and more. The details have been thoroughly defined according to the requirements. Now let's move on to the next step. This time, let's ask it to generate a database schema. Design the database schema. The second step, the Prisma agent, takes the requirements specification we created earlier and defines the database schema needed to build the service. First, before defining the database schema, it generates the related tables. It then writes the database schema for those tables. Next, it verifies whether the schema has been generated correctly. Next, it checks the verified database schema to ensure there are no syntax errors. If there are any syntax errors, they are corrected in the correct step. All done. Let's check if the database schema has been generated correctly. Let's take a closer look at the ERD. Looking at the systematic view here, the elements needed to implement a community platform service are neatly organized into database tables. We can see that things like community categories and banned words have been defined. Judging by the volume, it looks thoroughly detailed based on the requirements. The database structure has been defined in great detail. It looks really well put together. Next, let's ask it to generate the API interface. Create the API interface specification. The interface agent, based on the requirements specification and the database schema, generates the API interfaces. It creates the backend APIs needed for the service, along with their input and output data types, all aligned with each API's function and purpose. First, based on the database schema, it groups similar entities together into endpoint groups. And then it creates the API interfaces needed for user authentication. And then for each group created earlier, it generates the endpoints needed for the service. Next, for each endpoint, it writes a description of what functionality that endpoint performs. And then it checks to ensure that the operation has been written correctly. Next, it defines the input and output data formats for each operation. Finally, the schema review checks to ensure everything has been written correctly. It's done. Let's review it together. Shall we take a look at what's been implemented in the controller? From the looks of it, this seems to be a controller that includes the functionality for users to create posts. Here we can see a method defined for creating a user's post. And here we can also see a method for updating posts. Let's see if the interface agent also generated the DTO properly. The types look excellent. I see the pagination DTO has also been defined, which is exactly what we'd expect for a community board. Excellent. The final result should be exciting. Let's keep going. Alright, let's go back to AutoB and move on to the next step. Now, let's ask it to generate the end-to-end test functions. Make the E2E test functions. The test agent takes the API interfaces defined in the previous step and writes end-to-end test code by composing user scenarios. These tests help ensure the business logic is implemented properly and maintain quality. At this stage, AutoB writes scenarios to compose the end-to-end tests. And then it writes these scenarios as test code. The validation events check the generated test code to ensure there are no compilation errors. And if any compilation errors are found, it then proceeds to fix them. With that, the testing process is now complete. Here we are, almost at the finish line. Finally, let's ask it to implement the API functions. Implement API functions. Then the Realize agent starts running. The Realize agent brings everything together and writes the actual code. First, in this step, it writes the logic related to user authentication. And then it checks the implemented authentication logic for any compilation errors. Now, based on all the outputs so far, it generates the business logic. Almost at the end, it checks the generated business logic to ensure there are no compilation errors. And if there are any compilation errors, it fixes them. Now we've completed the final step with the Realize agent, so let's take a look at the results. Shall we take another look at the controller code we saw earlier? In the code we saw earlier, a decorator called MemberAuth for user authentication has now been added. Let's see if the post-update API has been implemented correctly. Inside the provider function, we can see the logic that handles post updates. This code checks whether a post has already been deleted when a user tries to update it. And in the section below, it ensures that only the original author of the post can update it. And after going through this process, we can see the code here that updates the post data. Great! It looks like the detailed logic we expect in a community app has been implemented well. Now we'll download the code project so we can run it on our local server. As we type these commands into the terminal to run the server, the execution was successful. Great! Now that we've successfully generated and run the backend of the community service with AutoB, let's move on to the next step. With the results from AutoB and the Reddit-style design we've prepared in advance, we can use AutoView to generate the front end and assemble a full web application. Shall we get started with AutoView? I already have AutoView open in another window. To generate the front end from this backend, we need to enter the localhost URL that's now running into AutoView. And in AutoView, we'll paste in the Reddit-style Figma design we prepared in advance. The pages in the design flow together like this. So, shall we select this entire design flow as a section and share it by a link? I've inserted the Figma design link along with the backend server address into AutoView. Now, let's go ahead and run the pipeline. AutoView has now started, and the icons, components, pages, and interactions are being generated one after another. First, AutoView generates component specifications, analyzing sets, tracing the master components used in the design, handling their instances, and then producing the component code. On the left sidebar, you can see each component being generated as code and stacked neatly into the components folder. Next, AutoView builds the sitemap. It creates the structure of the pages from the design, sets up the routes, and reads the annotations and interaction values written on each page to apply the details. Finally, it generates the pages. If you look at the sidebar, you'll notice that the main pages, Home, Post, Search, and Community, have all been created inside the Pages folder. It's finished. Now, shall we take a look at the full-stack community application built with AutoBee and AutoView? By clicking the window that appears in the terminal, we'll be connected to the local server. Great, we've landed on the community home feed, and it looks just like the design. There are posts listed, and when we click on one, it takes us to the detail page just as expected. We can also add replies to comments. When we edit a comment, then navigate to another page and come back, the changes are still there. This shows that the backend generated by AutoBee is properly connected to the front end and working as intended. In the Explore tab, we can see several communities that were pre-generated in the database. Let's go ahead and create a community, the higher-level concept above posts. The new community has been created successfully. Then let's try writing a new post in this community. Both the post and its comments have been successfully added to the new community. Excellent. With this, we've seen how a full application can be generated from backend to front end with just a single request. AutoBee is already open source and available on GitHub, and AutoView is currently under active development. Stay tuned for what's next with AutoBee and AutoView.